Welcome to the Char Chit Chat, a podcast exploring all things biochar related, coming to you from a small sheep and tree farm in the deep south of New Zealand. In this episode, I'm going to use content from a 9-minute video about the City to Farm project that Betsy Kettle is involved in, and then I will play the interview.
For the past 5 years, since 2019, we've been running something called the City to Farm Project, which diverts food scraps from the Hibiscus Coast area out to the Granger's farm. The farm is about 25 k's from Hibiscus Coast where the food scraps are coming. And so we have a box truck that goes around with a tail lift on it and collects the food scraps in the form of buckets and wheelie bins and brings them out to the farm. And then they sit on the jetty, which Phil and his neighbor built. Keeps all the wheelie bins out of the mud, and the wheelie bins sit and the bokashi composted food scraps cure for about 4 weeks. That pre-composts the materials so they break down very quickly in the swales or in the spice piles. So why are we doing this? Why are we spending all this time and effort to divert food scraps out to a farm for composting? Well, we're trying to prove that we can improve rural soil. Clay soil, which is what we have a lot of around here, and change it from one that's non-productive to being productive. So we planted bananas at the same time we started the composting, and now the banana palms are quite big. I don't think the Grangers could have grown bananas before we started doing this. We're getting bananas, and they're coming on stronger every year. We have a number of different ways we compost on the farm. The usual method is swale composting, and it's basically piling the soil up on the downhill side and then putting layers of biochar in the bottom of the swale and putting food scraps on top. And the process is interesting. It goes through bokashi composting in the buckets or wheelie bins. It heats up a bit when it gets layered into the swales with the mulch and the food scraps, and then it turns into a giant worm farm. Sometimes it's too wet to get the tractor next to the swales. So then we do something called spice piles. And it's basically layering up the bokashi composted food scraps, which are full of all kinds of beneficial microorganisms, a lot of which can survive in anaerobic conditions and actually help break the food scraps down in anaerobic conditions. And basically you layer up the food scraps with the mulch, you cover the whole thing with black plastic, and it heats up until it runs out of oxygen, and then it composts anaerobically. We've ended up doing lots and lots of spice piles. The research that's come out of the Amazon about Terra Preta, it's the biochar that's probably the most unique ingredient. What we found with the biochar is it helps us a number of different ways. It increases the carbon content of the soil through its stable carbon form by itself, but also by the way it houses microorganisms. It's very porous, very honeycomb-like, and the little microorganisms seem to love living inside of it. And so you have a much greater surface area for the microorganisms to populate. The bodies of the little microorganisms contain carbon, so that increases the carbon content as well. And there are soil scientists now that say the soil is capable of absorbing at least half of all the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We can see why the Amazonians used it. It has all these amazing properties. And of course, we're just starting to discover this too. Biochar is one of the most researched topics on the planet right now. There's so much interest in it as a carbon sink. We've been running a program in schools for the past 5 years called the Zero Waste, Zero Carbon program. And originally it focused on getting the students to value food scraps, keep them out of the landfill, and put them into composting systems instead. So the idea occurred, why don't we do in the schools what we're doing in the farm? Why don't we give the students some clay and see if they can turn it into topsoil? And we called it the Carbon Sinking Project. The students got really excited about it, especially when we explained about it in terms of Terra Preta. You know, here's this incredible soil that we don't know how it happened. Can you help us figure out how this soil occurred?
And then we're going to seal it up and we're going to send it away to the lab and they're going to test it. And they'll test for all these things here. So we're just going to do a basic soil test, so that'll cover most of those elements.
So now they had something to do with their food scraps. Instead of sending them off to the banana farm, let's see if we can use them on site and see if we can transform clay.
So today we're going to dig the bed. So there's a bit of drilling and a bit of sawing and a bit of digging to do today. We're just going to do that in smallest groups. And how long does it take to make 1 centimetre of quality topsoil anyway? What do we say? 1,000 years. Can we wait 1,000 years? We haven't got time. We're going to speed it up. We're going to try and speed it up. Thanks. Who's got the box?
We probably doubled the amount of food scraps that we're getting from the students. And they are digging it into the compost beds or carbon sinking beds. And we have a fellow called Paul Candy with Fonterra who comes out with a whole set of different kits.
Okay. The biology in the soil keeps the soil warm, so it'll stay much more productive for much longer. So if you push that into the ground,
it's wet. Yeah, it already went to wet.
Yeah, straight to wet. So the
wet.
ground is super saturated because we've just had so much rain. I do testing for farmers, so I'll go on their farm and I'll do a range of tests. So most farms in New Zealand suffer quite severely from compaction. So what's compaction?
And they test the density of the soil, the infiltration rates. We send samples into the lab to get fertility levels, pH, organic matter content, density. And we will monitor this over time and see what happens.
Where should we write it? Here. Biochar. Biochar. Added biochar. Yeah.
So it's not too acidic. If it was too acidic, we need to add something. And air movement in soil is really critical. Oh, there you go, straight away. Worms. So what worms will do when the soil gets really, really dry, do you know what happens to the worms? Where do they go?
They tunnel.
They tunnel deeper.
Try and find moist.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
That was one of the reasons we started this project. Let's see if we can make Terra Preta. Let's see if we could turn this terrible clay soil into this incredibly rich, fertile carbon sink. The advantage of using the biochar is it becomes permanent. To me, that's where we should be focusing our research. How do we make this permanent? How do we do this as fast as possible? Something that one of the facilitators, the carbon sinking composting facilitators, has said to me is that when they were setting up a carbon sinking bed and digging the food scraps in at Glenfield Intermediate, she said one boy came up to her and said, you know, we write these reports all the time about climate change and we do studies, but now we get to do something about it.
Hi, Betsy. Thank you for joining me today. I'd like to start by asking you, who is Betsy Kettle?
Well, thank you, Dylan. I'm keen to answer your questions. I was once a U.S. citizen. I married a Kiwi, 35 years ago, brought me to New Zealand. I've been here for the past 30 years. But the bane of my life, which is clay soil, has followed me from place to place. I came from Iowa in the United States, that a place that used to have, 2 meters of beautiful topsoil. And in many places, like where I lived, it was down to the clay subsoil. And then when we moved to Pakuranga, it was clay soil. And then when we moved out here to Wainui, clay soil. And all of my jobs, like working with the rural disadvantaged on trying to grow food, the problem was clay soil. Doing permaculture projects, clay soil. So yeah, as soon as I heard about biochar and Terra Preta and the idea of being able to transform clay soil permanently, I started researching biochar. And that was probably 2013.
Awesome. And do you remember that exact point that you first heard about biochar?
Yeah, I was a certification manager for Organic Farm New Zealand, and Dennis Enright, who was also with Organic Farm, was up in Auckland, and he came to my house with biochar, and we went out to the garden and we talked about it, and he showed it to me, and I was doubtful. It seemed like too good to be true.
Mm.
But then I attended a workshop down at Massey in Palmerston North on it when Dr. Marta Camps was there.
Hmm.
And she convinced me that this was real. And, they were still, though, at that stage at Massey, they were still trying to determine the different properties of biochar for different uses. So she couldn't actually say that you need this sort of biochar to improve clay soil.
Yeah. Okay, I'll come back to that. If a stranger asks you what biochar is, what do you tell them?
I tell them it's a woody material, usually something like sawdust, that has been baked at temperatures over 450 degrees for over 6 hours without oxygen. And it creates a very stable form of carbon that doesn't decompose in the soil.
Hmm.
And that biochar, when it's used properly in the soil, acts as a permanent form of compost to hold on to water and hold on to nutrients and change the soil structure. But because it doesn't decompose, the changes are permanent.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's what I love about it is that you ha make that effort, you spend the money or whatever, you get it in the soil and it's there for a long, long time. And then if you are able to add a little more and add a little more, it just builds on itself and it's so satisfying. So I'm guessing that's what you're seeing already on your projects. So yeah, would you like to tell me, is it separate? What do you use biochar for individually at like do you use it at home? And then we'll come to talking about your other projects I know that you have going on.
Yes, we definitely use it at home. We have a bokashi bucket
Hmm.
and we have a worm farm. We put the the biochar in the bottom of the bokashi bucket so that it can be charged and inoculated through that process. And we also put it into the worm farm so it can be charged and inoculated through that process. But what we have found is unless we do this, the soil, the plants turn all yellow and sickly. That was my first experiment,
Hmm.
and it definitely didn't work with raw biochar. And so after that, we just started making sure it was well composted before using it in good garden soil.
Yeah.
But what I've heard is that you can, if you want a faster transformation of really poor, clay subsoil into topsoil, you use raw biochar because it is more reactive. But I would love to know more about that and see if anyone else has experience with that.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I've studied a lot of permaculture and I know that clay soil technically actually has very high nutrients. And so perhaps it's the biochar, allowing the soil to drain better. So it's the soil structure that's improving, which then makes the clay soil become less anaerobic. because I think it's the anaerobic conditions perhaps that change the pH, and that change in pH locks up certain nutrients, and the plants can't access those. So I'm guessing that that's the pathway. It's actually just quickly improves the structure, which then gives more air, which then changes the pH a little bit, and then it makes the nutrients kind of available. That's my take on it.
I would love to talk to someone who knows more about it than I do, but our experience out at the Banana Swale Project, which is a much larger scale project, where we've been doing this now for 6 years, is that it took about 3 years of biochar being in contact with the clay soil to actually change the soil structure at enough depth to get this, really noticeable changes, improvements in soil infiltration rates and groundwater storage. It took
Hmm.
somewhere between 3 and 4 years. And before that, the water would stand after, at the end of winter or the middle, let's say the middle of winter, the water would just stand in the swales and it wouldn't drain.
Hmm.
But then after 3 or 4 years, halfway through winter, the water was disappearing in the old swales, but it was still standing in the new swales. So,
Okay.
and that's when we started doing the infiltration testing. And we noticed that the infiltration rate had improved like 25 to 30 times in some places.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's get into a bit more about that project because I watched a video about it and it's fascinating and it's great. And I'd love to ask some questions that perhaps weren't answered in that video. First of all, you are referring to swales. So can you tell us what a swale is for those that don't know? And then also just the general process of how you add your materials into that. And I'm really interested in how much in terms of volume of biochar goes in.
Okay, so a swale is something that anybody with clay soil should have, particularly if they're on a slope. It's a shallow ditch, a very gentle ditch that runs parallel to the contours, although we have found that if it has about a 3% fall, it will drain a lot better when you have clay soils. And what is excavated out of the shallow trench is mounded up in the downhill side.
Hmm.
So we end up composting in the shallow ditch in the swale, planting the bund, that mound, in our case with bananas, but it could be anything. It could be food forests, it could be orchards, it could be nut trees, whatever you wanted. And then we start putting layers of food scraps and woody mulch. So the first step is to scoop out the swales, make sure they have the right fall. The next step, we put 5 centimeters of biochar on the bottom, raw biochar on the bottom, 10 centimeters of woody mulch, 10 centimeters of food scraps. This is bokashi composted food scraps with biochar in it, and then 10 centimeters of woody mulch over the top. And my husband did the calculations on that to get the right carbon to nitrogen ratios for composting.
Hmm.
And what ends up happening is the food scraps will heat up to maybe 40 or 50 degrees. It's not a hot composting. It's kind of I guess you'd call it mesophilic composting temperature. And then when that cools down, the worms move in. So basically the food scraps go through a three-phase compost, well, actually a four-stage composting process. First in the bokashi bins, then the warm mesophilic temperature rise, then with the worms, and then you start getting the soil structure and all the roots from the bananas starting to feed the fungal biome. And so then you start having the materials break down fungally. And that, yeah, it creates an incredible environment for the bananas. And it seems that everything just takes off.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, it's a really good description. A four-stage decomposition. Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more what bokashi is? Because I think some people might be going, oh, what is bokashi?
Ah, yeah. Okay, that's a good question. Bushi is a Japanese fermentation composting system. So basically, it's more anaerobic than aerobic. And it takes, the great thing about it is that it takes all different types of food scraps. So it will take all the things that worms won't. It'll take citrus and meat and white bread and cooked food and onion skins and garlic and spicy, everything it will take. So that makes it really good for the commercial kitchens that we get our food scraps from.
Mm.
And what it does with the commercial kitchens, basically put their food scraps into a wheelie bin and they layer up their food scraps. So for every maybe 6 or 8 inches, every 150 to 200 millimeters, they sprinkle a scoop of this microbial inoculant that's full of microorganisms that ferment food.
Mm-hmm.
And these are things that turn milk into yogurt and cabbage into sauerkraut. They're all kind of food modifying fermentation microorganisms. And the bokashi ferments, it breaks down the cellular structure of the food scraps, and you start getting all this liquid coming off. And it's pre-composted. So when it does go into an aerobic system, which is the swales, it breaks down extremely quickly. And of course, the advantage to that is you don't have the rat attractant for so long. It's there for a it basically turns into stuff that nothing would want, no critter would want to eat after a couple of weeks. So that's one of the reasons we do it. But the other thing that happens is we put biochar in the mix. The biochar goes down into the bottom of the wheelie bin so that when these food scraps break down and this liquid comes out, the biochar becomes inoculated with microorganisms and with minerals.
Mm.
And then the biochar also alters the pH because the bokashi liquid is quite acidic.
Yeah.
And of course, the biochar is quite alkaline. So it helps do that. And it also helps control odors.
Yeah. How deep is that layer in the wheelie bin?
We put about 3 liters of biochar
Okay.
in the bottom of each wheelie bin.
And it's a standard wheelie bin, isn't it? It's like a 200-liter wheelie bin that you get at the roadside curb.
No, it's smaller than that. But
Oh.
that's a good point, because if you had 200 liters of some of the food scraps we get, you couldn't move it. So we actually try to use 80 and like 120. I think the biggest wheelie bins we use are 140s. Those are the ones that are only supposed to get like cabbage leaves and green sort of veggies that are really fluffy and don't weigh very much. So, but if we get like leftover casseroles, it's really gloppy. And it gets gloppier through the fermentation process. And that's really, really heavy. So we need the smaller wheelie bins for places where we get a lot of cooked food.
Uh-huh. Yes. I've been collecting food waste for many years, probably over a decade, and I know exactly what you mean, that some buckets are super heavy and other buckets are very light. And yeah, the liquid builds up in the bottom quite quickly and so on. Now, who pays for this? I mean, I'm interested in this because obviously I'd love people to duplicate this kind of project, but are the restaurants and the places where you get the food waste from, are they paying for the bokashi mix that they put in, or are you guys getting external funding for that, or how does it work?
Well, how it works now, our organization, the Sustainable North Trust, operates this food scrap collection called the City to Farm Project
Mm-hmm.
as a social enterprise. So we're not there to make a profit. We have to make enough of a profit to pay for everything, but it's not like we have shareholders. We
Mm-hmm.
just, if we make any money, we put it back into the system, which is good because at this stage, without legislation that bans organic matter to landfill, it's hard to charge the true price of doing this. How it works is we borrow the farmer's truck. We pay for his mileage, the mileage that we use and the ruck charges, and we pay for the petrol that we use. But basically, the farmer is letting us use his truck in exchange for all the food scraps and the materials for composting. So that's the first stage. You have to find somebody that really wants this stuff, that's willing to pay for it, at least help you with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we need to find commercial kitchens, whether they're in restaurants, cafes, retirement villages, early childhood education centers, schools, marinas. They need to be groups that are willing to pay to have it taken away. Now, here in Auckland, it's a bit awkward to do this because residential people have a free food scrap collection service. So we can't collect residential food scraps. And it's actually cheaper here in Auckland to put stuff in the landfill, food scraps in the landfill, rather than to pay to have it taken away. So we have to find the ones that are really sustainability focused,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually hard to do. And the supermarkets, unfortunately, even though they say they're really clean and green, tend not to be willing to pay for it. But saying that, they often have food rescue groups that come in first, pig farmers that come in and take stuff away, and they don't really want to pay us for the residual because it's cheaper to put it into a landfill bin. So we don't have any supermarkets on board yet. We're keeping our fingers crossed. But if you're in an area where the landfill is owned by the council rather than private industry, and if you don't have a free food scrap collection, then you should be able to get lots of food scraps. And it'll be a lot easier. We're doing it in one of the hardest places in the country to do it. So if you can do it, if you're in the right place, it should be a lot easier.
Yeah. And when you say it's a free food scrap collection, is that not just part of people's rates that they're already actually paying for?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, my next question with your project is where do you get the biochar from? And again, how do you raise money to pay for the biochar?
Okay, so the commercial kitchens pay for basically the biochar, the bokashi, the stompers, the collection. So it all comes from the charges
Okay.
that we charge the commercial kitchens. When a commercial kitchen gets low on, say, their Zing, their microbial inoculant, they
Mhm.
put their Zing container out on top of their wheelie bin, and the driver knows to refill it. So we continually refill and supply the Zing, and of course the biochar comes in the wheelie bins. That's delivered along, So basically, the truck with the tail lift shows up. We drop off wheelie bins with the mulch and the biochar in the bottom and take away the full ones,
Yeah.
the full wheelie bins.
Okay, so you've built it up so that it's financially sustaining itself, where the costs that you have are paid for by the people getting the food waste collected, and that's balancing out more or less.
Well, kind of.
Okay.
The City to Farm project has two parts. There's the city to farm and the farm to the city. So the city to farm part, where we collect the food scraps and take them out to the farm, that part is paid for by the food scrap collection.
Yeah.
But then what the farmer does with them, how they compost them, how they build swales or Johnson Sues, or the many different types of composting systems they have, that's up to them.
Yeah.
So there's kind of this line between getting the food scraps out there, which is our side, the city to farm side, and then the farmer's side, which is farm to city side, using those food scraps to grow more food to go back to the city.
Hmm. Yeah, and you have to find a farmer that's willing to put in that extra work rather than just going and buying commercial compost or buying fertilizer, and then they have to do a whole lot of extra work. And yeah, it's not always easy to find somewhere. It looks from your video like you have found someone there that's very keen. I love their little tractor attachment where it's got this little belt-driven conveyor system where the food waste gets pushed out the side of the container into the swales as he drives along. I mean, that's an amazing innovation.
Yeah, hey, Phil and Jenny were great. they really thought it out. So first of all, they got something called an orchard tractor, which is quite low to the ground and has quite a narrow wheelbase so that you can plant your rows of bananas or whatever you're growing close together and have the tractor low so it can get it underneath the branches.
Mm.
So they got that. And then they also got something called a fast feeder. And it's usually used to feed out grain to the cattle or the pigs.
Ah,
And it works like a scoop. You can put it down like a front end loader and use it as a scoop, or you can, and once it's full, you can take the food scraps or the mulch out to the swales, turn on the conveyor belt in the bottom, and it feeds out the mulch or the food scraps into the swales. It still needs to be raked out a little bit,
hmm.
but when we first started, we were rolling wheelie bins across the paddock and then manually picking them up and dumping them. And that didn't last very long at all. Phil and Jenny
Yeah.
kind of went, no, we're
Yeah.
not going to do it this way. Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, you're right. You really need to find someone who's keen and who has that commitment to the environment to do the right thing, and also the knowledge about why the current system is so bad
Yeah.
so that they're motivated, to do the right thing.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, no, you've done very well there to find that farm. All right. Is there anything else that you'd like to add about the City to Farm project? Like, have you got plans for a
Oh,
second farm to be involved or to expand to any other area in New Zealand?
there's a whole bunch of things I'd love to be able to say about the City to Farm project. We're trying to see if we can develop Terra Preta. And we know that the Amazonians have changed clay to, prime agricultural soil that is a carbon sink. But we don't know how they did it. So we've modeled our system out of the little bit that we've heard, which is that they took biochar and lots of organic waste and put them on the ground. So, and we also know that it took a bit of time, but we don't know how much, how long.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to us to find that there was such a huge change in soil structure within 3 or 4 years. Now, it didn't look like topsoil, but it had started to get that structure, that aggregation of soil particles, which lets the air and the water move through, which is the first step in topsoil formation. And it just seems that one of the most important things MPI could be doing right now is trying to work out what is the fastest way to grow topsoil. Not only grow it, but to keep it there permanently. And I think this is where biochar comes in. So we've been doing a series of soil tests. At the very beginning, we did initial tests on what was there, and now we're comparing it over time as the soil changes. So we're actually looking at the soil underneath the banana swales. And we have a master's student, which a lot of the biochar members may know, Matthew Priestley,
Hmm.
because he was on the biochar network chair or board for a number of years. And then he's taken this project on. So it's great to have him because he knows about biochar.
Cool. Yeah.
And he's keen to do exactly the same thing that we're doing, which is let's see if we can make it.
And which university is he studying with or working with?
He's working with Massey
Oh, yeah.
at Palmerston North, which is
Yeah.
the ag university, but it's also the one that has had the big biochar research lab.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, that's cool. And you didn't say where you got your biochar from.
Well, look, we're just getting it from Soil Pro, who gets it from the Red Stag Mills out of Rotorua.
Oh, yeah.
And so technically he calls it high carbon boiler ash rather than biochar. And the reason he has explained is because of the variability within the furnace that it's made in. Yeah. It's also affordable because, we can get it by the cubic meter bag for a couple $100s. The other thing is because it's affordable, it will be what the most people use. And
Yes.
so we want to find out what is the kind of lowest common denominator here, which is this is the cheapest, it's the most readily available. Let's see what it'll do.
Yeah. And with regards to those swales, what you told me before, where you put in the 5 centimeters of char and then your bokashi food waste material and then your woody mulch, do you do that more than once on the same swale, or is it a one-time thing, or are you doing it again a second time in the same year, or are you just doing it the next year? How often do you do it?
Excellent question. Yes, we put it down 2 or 3 times a year on each swale. So that means that some of these swales that have been in place for 6 years have had the equivalent of maybe 1.2 meters worth of composted food scraps and biochar added. But you wouldn't know it if you see the pictures in the video. It's just flat to the ground. And it's because it's broken down and it's gone in, hopefully a lot of it's gone into the soil.
Okay, so the swale is still there though. It hasn't filled up the swale. It's not like now a terrace instead of being a bit of a dip.
It's filled up the swale, but it's filled up with a very loose organic material.
Hmm.
And when we add another layer on, it'll be mounded up for a little while, but over time it disappears. And if you dig down into the swale, you can no longer find a clear boundary between what was the bottom of the swale and the soil that's forming underneath. So we need to dig a lot more swales, but the swale is only supposed to be about 300 deep, but it's very easy to dig down 600 and it still looks like soil, more soil than compost. So something is pulling it down, something is changing the soil underneath the swales.
Yeah.
And whether that's worms or the fungal material, or our theory is that when you do in situ composting, where you're making compost where you're going to grow, it's a much lower carbon form of composting, but it's also better for the plants because they create this ecosystem with the soil microbiome that benefits them. The soil is undisturbed. They can create these incredible fungal mats like what you would have in a Terra Preta situation. Plants will feed the soil microbiome to suit themselves. And so the bananas are feeding this soil microbiome to give them exactly what they want. And we think that's how it should be. That's how we should be growing things.
Hmm. And does the farmer grow anything else in between the bananas and like maybe in the swales? Does he do any other kind of crops as such?
Yeah, another great question. We have something called kikuyu up here.
Yes.
And one of the first things that was discovered was besides bananas growing really well, the kikuyu grows really well
Oh yeah.
around the swales. So they've been experimenting with what to grow underneath bananas to keep the kikuyu knocked back. You can't really get rid of it. And then what could be productive. So the squash family, pumpkins,
Yes.
melons, they come up by themselves. The tomatoes, they'll all come up by themselves. And they do beautifully, and they make this wonderful ground cover underneath the bananas. And nasturtiums also produce a lot of shade. Of course, that's not a productive, but yeah, it's basically the squash family right now.
And is the farmer then harvesting those and selling them?
He's not selling them. He could be,
Hmm.
but because he has a big heart in a factory with a lot of people working in it, he's been taking a lot of the pumpkins and bananas, well, some of the bananas, mainly the pumpkins, to the factory to give to his workers.
Okay. Yep.
Well, that and the other thing is when the pumpkins come up by themselves, you don't know if they're true to form or not.
No.
So they might look like a pumpkin, but the inside might be a zucchini, or you might have something that looks like a zucchini and actually it's a pumpkin. So, that's another, it's kind
Yeah.
of like potluck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might look amazing, but not actually have any good taste or whatever. But you also might find some gems in there. You might find some new ones that are amazing. Yeah. Cool. So you get this like cover crop
Yeah.
that just naturally comes up. I'm guessing, do the tomatoes actually fruit as well and give good fruit, or do they tend to just kind of fall over and not do much?
Well, nobody stakes them up, so they fall over, but they produce prolifically too.
Wow.
Yeah. In fact, Phil and Jenny have the problem of not being able to harvest enough fast enough. They've hired someone now to come in and help them,
Hmm.
and they've told her basically, we'll take the bananas, but look, why don't you start selling the pups, the flowers, and the leaves? Because we have quite a large Asian community in the
Mm,
Auckland area, very keen, for these things. Uh, So she's just working on that now.
great.
I think they've done studies on bananas that say if you have a hectare of fully productive bananas, you could make 50,000 a year just from the bananas.
Uh-huh.
So there's an incredible interest, particularly up in Northland where it's warmer and tends to be more frost-free, on growing bananas. But of course, the issue is traditionally bananas are fed, they're really heavy feeders. So you use really potent fertilizers. And the value of the food scraps is they're very high in potassium, which bananas need. And bananas can eat this very raw sort of form of food scraps that most plants can't eat and grow basically organically.
Yeah.
Um, and that's part of Matthew's master's thesis is to look at the banana production using food scraps as opposed to chemical fertilizers.
Yeah. No, that'll be a really interesting result to see that. And I'm sure it's just going to increase and increase over time, especially as the soil improves. The yields, I think, will go through the roof. Yeah.
Yeah, we have noticed that the banana bunches are getting not necessarily more bananas, but the bananas on the bunches are getting bigger and bigger. So, and fatter. So that's nice.
Yeah. Cool. All right. And so are there any other plans to expand the project?
Yes. So right now we have Auckland Council has the climate action team within Auckland Council has recognized the value of what we're doing with the swale composting and just trying to get rural property owners on board with deepening their topsoil because if you can deepen your topsoil, you're not only creating a carbon sink, but you're creating an environment where water soaks in instead of running off. So you can buffer against extremes of drought and flooding,
Yes.
which affects the entire watershed. And if we can get them also to grow food, then that's another climate action,
Yeah.
growing local food for local food security. So the council is organizing workshops where we demonstrate easy on-farm composting using something called the Johnson-Su method
Hmm.
and basically getting an IBC, putting woody mulch in the bottom, layering it up with bokashi composted food scraps with biochar and woody mulch, and doing it right off the truck with the bin lifter. So basically rolling the wheelie bins to the end of the tail lift, using the bin lifter to tip them into the Johnson-Su system, and we can make a Johnson-Su wheelie bin in about an hour.
Wow.
And so, yeah, we'll be demonstrating that all over and also soil composting and holding workshops on a lot of interest in biochar, how to make biochar, how to use biochar, and having that all over sort of the Rodney district, which is the northern part of the Auckland region.
Hmm. Sounds great. Yeah, that's satisfying. I think that when you start a project and it keeps growing, that's really satisfying. So, no, well done. That's great to hear. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about in the last little bit we have together?
Well, I would just love to see a lot more people experimenting with biochar. And there's so much good that can come out of this, short term and long term, that it's really important work that we're all doing. And I really appreciate you offering this opportunity to talk on what we're doing and get the message out so that people can get excited and positive. We have too much negativity right now about climate change. And here's this fantastic option that everybody should, with rural property, should not only be doing, but should feel they have the responsibility to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great in your video to see that you're also working with a primary school and getting them excited about working with the soil and growing food and learning about Terra Preta and the biochar. I'd love to see a lot more of that happen too.
Yeah, well, hopefully this website that just launched, it's called the Zero Waste Zero Carbon.org.nz website. It's designed for schools to take what we've been doing here on the North Shore for the past 6 years and apply it to their own schools. So they basically divert their food scraps away from the rubbish bin back to the soil there at their schools to grow more food. So yeah, it's a cool project. We were funded by Foundation North, but they're not able to fund school projects anymore. They've got too many other desperate people needing more basic things. But yeah, hopefully this podcast will get information out about schools using that.
Yeah, and I think if schools are really keen and see the benefits of it, they will find the funding. So yeah, no, that sounds great as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Dylan.
Yeah, I will definitely try and catch up again. I don't know, in a couple of years maybe, just to see how the project's going, and even try and get hold of Matthew if you could send through his details and maybe have a chat with him and see it from his perspective. Because, like I say, I want to interview anyone and everyone who's got something to do with biochar. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, I can do that. Great. Well, thanks. Thank you.